Okay, I am back. Oh, shoot. And I am going to read to you the last chapter, or the next chapter, which is the life after the Duke died. And in it, you'll see that the Duchess of Windsor, she remains in Paris. She lived in isolation. She was a recluse, but she had declining health. She had other plans to do things, but she had declining health. She had arterialsclerosis, dementia, stroke. She was left a very sizable estate from the Duke, and it was quite something. Um, she was left a very sizable estate from the Duke because he wanted her well taken care of. He asked people around, before he died, that certain people would take care of him. They had a wonderful group of friends, but with her declining health, she ended up becoming isolated and on feeding tubes, it's a very sad story. She lived this way for 14 years, and she died on April 24th, 1986. And then she was buried at Frogmore Burial House because that's what the Duke wanted. He wanted her buried next to her, and she wanted to be buried next to him. As you see from the last chapter, she wanted to just be buried underneath the tree, you know, and that was perfectly fine for her. So I'm going to go ahead and get started reading. Kind of rusty at this, so. But this here is entitled Chapter 4, The Duchess and Her Household. For those that are interested, this book can be found on Amazon, and it really is a very valuable book. Behind Closed Doors, it's written by Hugo Vickers. And I just think if anybody is interested in their story, this is such an important piece of their story, especially with Wallis Simpson and the way she spent her life afterwards. That's the first part of the book. It's broken into two parts with several chapters in each part. The front half of the book actually covers the last years of Wallis Simpson. Now, the last half of the book, it tells you of Wallis Simpson's life and how their romance got started, and then of course it leads up to the abdication. So this is reading from part 1. The Duke of Windsor returned to Paris, the Duchess of Windsor returned to Paris to face the predicament of widowhood. She had no relations of her own and inevitably a dwindling number of friends. She knew she would lose some friends that she had shared with the Duke. Widows were often deserted. She had dropped some widows herself. She felt the world hated her and resented her designated role as the woman who had caused the abdication. She was anxious to do nothing to upset the royal family. She was not without help, but while the Duke lived, he had arranged everything. Now, after his death, she had to take control. She was frequently horrified by the cost of things. A dinner at Barat's to thank those who had looked after her struck her as horrendously expensive. It's not surprising that she found life bewildering. She was also in a state of shock, since she had scarcely ever been apart from the Duke since their marriage in 1937. As Monsignor Martin, her chauffeur, put it, she missed the space he occupied. In those early days of widowhood, there were numerous letters of sympathy, written either in English or French, that required her attention. Among those she thanked personally were President Pompidou and Maurice Schumann. This is a good moment to look at the Duchess's household staff, legal advisors, and some of the other principal characters in the story, since they all play a part in the events that follow, some with less credit than others. It was not as easy a time for any of them as they adapted to life without the Duke and with the Duchess far from well. In 1972, the Duchess was looked after by 2 secretaries and a large staff in her house in Paris. She had an English lawyer, Sir Godfrey Morley of Allen and Overy, the American attorney, Henry G. Walter in New York, a Swiss banker, Maurice Amuget, James Fitch, the Duke's stockholder with E.R. Lewis and Company in London, and in Paris, a French lawyer, Maître Suzanne Blum. This Suzanne Blum, she is something else, I tell you. She is the antagonist in this story. Well, some of these were honorable figures, others were not. There are dangers for rich widows who have considerable amount of worldly goods if they are in frail health and have no blood relations of their own. The more so if their affairs are handled by a dishonest lawyer and an avaricious banker, and they are served by a sly butler, their health overseen by a doctor acting on the instructions of the lawyer. That is a key paragraph right there, because, as I said, she's kept on feeding tubes, all by the instruction of this Suzanne Blum. It just shows you how, you're vulnerable when you're of a certain age, and when you don't have good people looking out for you, you are just, no matter how much money you have, you're so vulnerable. And in the house were the 2 secretaries, and at this time they ran the Duchess's establishment between them. John Utter had held the post of the Duke's private secretary since July 1962. He was a former diplomat who had left the American diplomatic service during the McCarthy purges, and he had been recommended to the Duke by a friend, possibly the then American ambassador. He was a kind and honorable man, but not forceful. The Duchess never really liked him, and hardly had the Duke died than she tried to dispense of his services. Nevertheless, he was to remain in his post until early 1975. John Ellington Utter was born in Elvira, New York, in 1905 and educated at Harvard Business School. He was a magna cum laude. He took the Foreign Service exam but failed the oral part, though later he spoke perfect French and had a good knowledge of German, Spanish, and Italian. He then became a banker with the National City Bank of New York, first in the U.S. and later in Paris. He was in Paris at the time of German invasion and underwent a grueling time escaping through France and Spain. He finally reached New York in the spring of 1941 and immediately applied to join the State Department. He was sent to Africa, arriving in Tangiers with 3 fellow recruits as vice consul: Robert Murphy, President Roosevelt's personal representative and minister to French North Africa, and it placed him and Harry A. Woodruff in Tunis to prepare the political ground for the Allied landings in North Africa. At one point, Utter and Woodruff were sent to Oran to retain an American consular present there. Many years later, he appeared in a book as a spy. One of FDR's 12 apostles, Utter was recruited by William Eddy onto William Dobbin's OSS team. He was a fellow diplomat. Kenneth Pendar recalled that there were oddly assorted groups for such a military job, and that in Tunis, John Utter was the bravest man in Africa. He had suffered an interminable series of boils, sheer torture, and in the humid climate, no one ever heard him complain. Utter was one of those who identified among the local residents and French officers as those who would help the Allied cause. A group of resistance cells was formed in Tunis and Bazet. Details of comings and goings by air, sea, and land about what the Germans and Italians were up to. and in other activities were obtained by spying, all of which had to be done without the knowledge of the U.S. Consul General, Hooker A. Doolittle, who disapproved of this activity being conducted from behind the cover of diplomatic posts. Secret transmitters were established to relay information between the various vice consuls. John Utter was jailed for 5 days in Tunis, followed by the Allied landings, but he managed to escape to Constantine in Algiers, where he and Woodruff worked with John Boyd on Robert Murphy's staff. There he made a new friend, Captain Andrew Robb, later well known as the cartoonist Robb of the Daily Express. Robb visited him at La Maison des Femmes at Sidi Bouy after he returned to Tunis, and described a meeting with Prince Ali Bey, the grandson of the last Bey of Tunis, and told how when Utter gave a picnic for a young prince, a procession of 8 or 10 Arabs arrived in advance bearing what was described as a little contribution, but which amounted to nothing less than a magnificent feast. For many years, John Utter would stay with Robb at the Mews House near Hyde Park Corner when he visited London. Utter was awarded the Medal of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of an outstanding service between June 1941 and November 1942. It was stated that he had obtained information from the French patriots of inestimable value to the Allied troops. He had been instrumental in setting up a clandestine radio station in Tunis, which maintained contact with Allied headquarters in Malta and Gibraltar. Throughout this period of 18 months, Mr. Utter performed secret missions, often at risk to his own life, in opposition to the German-Italian Armistice Commission. Utter also was an advisor to General Eisenhower at the Supreme Allied Headquarters. After the war, he served as the first secretary at the U.S. Embassy in Paris from 1948 until 1952. He occupied a splendid apartment in one of the Hôtel de Marcha at the Arc de Triomphe. Later, he was head of African Affairs at the Department of State in Washington. Being a confirmed bachelor, he realized his diplomatic career was under threat from Senator Joe McCarthy, and he resigned from the service. In December 1958, the Duke of Windsor discovered that his then private secretary, Victor Wadilov, who was based in an office in Buckingham Palace, had been embezzling money. A prolonged series of negotiations followed, conducted by Walter Monckton, as a result of which Wadilov, also known as Mr. Lightfingers as the Duchess now refers to him, was paid off, and the Duke decided to run his affairs from Paris instead. Some years later, John Utter was recommended to the Windsors, and he brought the benefit of his banking and diplomatic experience to the job. Wadilov left in 1959, and Utter began to work with the Windsors on 24 July 1962, his contract being finally signed by the Windsors on 9 November and witnessed by Sir Godfrey Morley. His salary was 2,000 new francs and rose to 4,000 in 1973. Needless to say, I knew none of this at the time I met him, nor did the Duchess of Windsor's personal secretary, Joanna Schutz, who shared an office with him for several years. He never spoke of his earlier career. Mindful of what it took to be my golden invitation to revisit the Windsor's house next time I was in Paris, I flew in specially for an afternoon from a holiday in the south of France to have my Burke's Guide to the Royal Family article checked. It was Monday, July 17th, about 5 weeks after the Duke's funeral. I did not think the Duchess was at home that day, but the office was a hive of activity as Mr. Utter, Miss Schutz, and others were busy answering the mass of letters of sympathy that had poured into the house since the Duke's death. A little printed card was being sent out to members of the general public to thank them for their messages of sympathy. If these were sent to friends, the Duchess sometimes added a few handwritten words of her own. Mr. Utter gave me iced tea on the terrace, and we sat there for a while in the beautiful afternoon sunshine as he looked through my work. Before my next visit to Paris in September, John Utter rang me in London and invited me to dinner. I was rather nervous before I went, being young and unsure as to what had inspired this invitation. But I needed not to have worried. On the evening of Sunday, the 17th of September, I went to his small apartment at Quai de Bethune on the Isle of St. Louis, and he took me for a delicious dinner at a local restaurant. This was the first time Mr. Utter talked to me of the Windsors as a real people, and they began to come alive for me in a whole different way. He told me about the funeral and how kind the Queen had been to the Duchess. She had told her that she could come to Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle and stay for as long as she liked, and she did not have to do anything she did not want to do. The strong implication was that both sides were keen to behave as well as possible in a situation that was difficult for both of them. The Queen hardly knew the Duchess. That's an important point, that the Queen offered for her to live there. He spoke of the Duke, how the people he most respected were tycoons and golfing professionals. He told me that on the occasion in 1966, the Duke had called down and asked him to come up. He found the Duke in the study part of his room, enveloped in clouds of smoke from his pipe. The Duke had two bits of bad news. The first was a letter from his sister-in-law, the Duchess of Gloucester, telling him that his younger brother, the Duke of Gloucester, had suffered a bad stroke. This would be Prince Henry, one of King George's sons. The second was that Monsignor Bodin of Jansen was downstairs in the hall with the Duchess, proposing some expensive improvements. The Duke dreaded the cost. John Utter said the Duchess often varied her story, saying whatever was in her mind at any given point. She was a typical Gemini. He had heard her relate stories that he had told about himself as if they had happened to her. He explained that her self-perception was as the heroine of Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. John also talked of how Sir Martin Charteris, the Queen's private secretary, had suggested he should write a memoir or some notes about the Windsors, which could be placed in the royal archives. Sir Martin told him that he could place an embargo date on this and it would be respected. But John was not too keen on the idea. One of his often repeated lines were, "They'll hate you if you destroy the myth," he said when the Windsors were alone at the mill without guests. They would go through after dinner and a decanter of whiskey would be brought in. They would not be tired enough to go to bed, but they had nothing to say to each other. So the contents of the decanter went slowly, slowly down, down, down. There were stories of the Duchess pressing her panic button and summoning the police at night. She worried about security despite the presence of a night watchman, the cages of the windows, and the 4 red panic buttons, one in the Duke's room, one in hers, one in George's room, and one in the pantry. These buttons summoned the police. In these years of widowhood, the Duchess frequently pressed hers, though would never admit to having done so. The police then came, but charged for an unnecessary summons. They used to say they had never seen a more secure house. John Utter warned the Duchess that if she pressed the button too often, it would become a cry of wolf situation. The Duchess remained nervous, and she used to say she never slept for fear that the night watchman might be asleep himself. He told me the press had questioned the Duchess's one use of the royal ducal coronet on the little card she sent out to those who wrote to her sympathy letters. But at the end of 1972, the College of Arms had agreed that she was entitled to use the royal Duchess's coronet. John brought the Windsors to life in these stories, painting a picture of how they spent their time. A few days later, I received a letter from him. It was so nice seeing you again. I hope that you will come back often to Paris. So my original misunderstanding of the golden invitation had suddenly become the true state of affairs. And from that time on, I always got in touch with John when I went to Paris, and paid several more visits to the house in Bois, and visited the country house in Osme 3 times. Some years later, he became yet more informative. He told me about the Duke's papers going to Windsor, how tiresome Lord Mountbatten was, and how Winston Guest had tried to get his hands on some of the Duke's possessions. He spoke of how he sometimes berated the Windsors for going out too much. The Duchess was tired after a fortnight of parties, John said. You should only go out 3 nights a week. The Duke looked up from behind his papers and said, "Hear, hear." Working with John was Joanna Schultz, the Duchess' personal secretary, since the 1st of September 1970. She was 27. She was vivacious and multilingual. When seen together, she and John Utter gave the impression they were on excellent terms, and in the summer of 1973, I was present at a lunch at Osmoy when Joanna and her mother and another friend of hers were fellow guests. Later, perhaps tensions increased as the Duchess became increasingly ill, culminating in John's retirement in 1975, at which point Joanna was in sole control in the office for 3 years. John Utter said that in order for the Windsors to employ Joanna, Francois Jacquet, the French secretary had to be dismissed. The Duke used to write out his letters in longhand on a yellow pad. Jack would type them up, tripled space, and he would correct them. She would then type a final copy. While John was in, Wigan had his hip operated on. She was sacked on the grounds that she could not take shorthand. Jacquet complained, and the Duke called in lawyers. He was advised that a sum between 1,000 and 1,500 would be appropriate. The Minister de Travail, and sometimes similar. So the Duke called in René de Chambron, the husband of José Laval. He said that more should be paid, so the Duke hid his letter and eventually made a settlement. John Utter said the Duke liked to talk German and Spanish. He often spoke German with Johanna Schutz, though was careful not to do so when the Duchess was around. I never had the chance in the 1970s to talk to Joanna far more than a few minutes about the Windsors, but later she related her experiences, after again bringing them to life very vividly. Joanna first met the Duke and the Duchess in Portugal in 1968 when they stayed with the Patinos, for whom her sister worked. The Duke wanted her to come and be his secretary, calling her once a month. Finally, she and her sister went together to see them in Paris. Joanna wearing a short corsage skirt and even a short-haired wig. The Duchess encouraged the Duke to employ her, perhaps thinking that Joanna would add a youthful sparkle to the house and she was offered the job. Joanna Schutz spoke 6 languages: German, French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. She'd been brought up by her father to count on a good education, but to expect no further financial help. "We are going to spend it," he said. Her father had died in 1968. Meanwhile, she had traveled the world and worked as a secretary at the Guatemalan embassy in Switzerland from 1963 to 1968, fulfilling numerous roles, including translating documents into Spanish, before taking a job preparing reports for scientific projects at Nestle in La Tour de Palais for a year. When Joanna accepted the job with the Windsors, she made it clear that she would take holidays. She knew what she wanted in life. She did not want a career or commitments or marriage, children, or security. Her aim in life was to explore the world, learning about different civilizations. She loved music and sport. She did not particularly want to do secretarial work, although she was very good at it. But one of the reasons she agreed to work for the Windsors was curiosity. She was intrigued by this couple, especially by the Duchess, who was mesmerizing in charm. She used her eyes very well. She could get you to do anything she wanted. There was an aura around the Windsors, and what Joanna saw as a devotion of an old couple to each other after long years of marriage. At the outset, the Duke said he could not pay her Swiss salary, but would put her in their will. Later, $480 a month payable in Switzerland was agreed. With $20 a day travel expenses, Joanna would work from 10 to 5 days a week. Was offered a lunch and a tea each day in the office, as well as a high tea like John Utter. And this had appealed to her, as she knew that the Windsors had the best chef in Paris. The Duke told her he wanted to get rid of John Utter and for her to take over, though this did not happen during his lifetime, nor did Joanna particularly want the additional commitment that would involve. But she said there came a time when the Duke no longer talked to John. She was told not to type his letters, and the Duke came to resent him, using his chauffeur to take him to the country house. She remembered that the Duke used to get very annoyed if proper respect was not paid to the Duchess, Her Royal Highness. Which was what he always called her. He asked Miss Schutz to stay on with the Duchess if anything happened to him, and she promised, "I will always stay with her as long as she needs me." Joanna acquired strong views about the abdication. She believed, as I do, that the Duchess of Windsor was a victim. The Duchess told her that she never forgave the Duke for abdicating. She left for France in December 1936, thinking that she had left the king and would never see him again. She was horrified when he abdicated. She said, "I aged 10 years in that year." Then they were separated for ages, but she was trapped. Evidently, she used to berate the Duke about this. The Duke had been spoiled as Prince of Wales. No one had ever said no to him. Thus, when it came to his wish to marry Miss Simpson, and suddenly they did say no, he was determined to have her no matter what the price. Joanna thought that for the Duke it was fine. He loved her, was always there to see her into her car, to meet her on her return. As long as the Duchess was there, he was happy. He was not happy to be effectively banished from his country. He loved England. Of that she was sure. What the Duchess thought about all this was less clear. It's hard to live with that kind of devotion. and perhaps later was hard to live without it. Joanna had accompanied the Windsors on the last visit to the United States in 1971. The Windsors rented an apartment, 40F, on the 37th floor of Waldorf Towers in New York. Also in the building was a new friend, Nathan Cummings, president of the Consolidated Foods, whose apartment was on the 31st floor. The Windsors stored some furniture at the Waldorf for an annual visit, and Nathan Cummings sent paintings up to adorn the apartment. Miss Schultz found a famous Renoir hanging in her office. She also found that the Windsors expected her to sleep in the office with maids walking through her room. To this she objected, and so was assigned a proper bedroom. Joanna was soon exposed to the spectacle of the Duchess getting her own way. The Duke was longing to go to Florida to stay with the Woodards, while the Duchess, as ever, preferred to stay in New York. A trip to Florida would be a considerable operation, with copious trunks of luggage preceding the Windsors to their next destination. Everything was in hand, and all was set for the journey until the night before the scheduled departure, when Joanna received an anxious call from the Duke, asking her to come up. She found the Duchess in bed, peeping plaintively from behind the sheets. She said she was ill. "Miss Schultz, you can see I can't possibly go." What could her secretary do but to agree? And so the visit was canceled. The next day, the Duchess was up and about and lunched with school friends, declaring she could not disappoint her. At this point, Joanna realized what a great actress the Duchess was. Nevertheless, she thought she could help the Duke. Aware that he needed a break, she thought if she sent the Duchess's dresses on ahead of them, then the Duchess herself would have to follow. Joanna did so. The same scenario was played out, and again the trip was canceled. The Windsors stayed in New York, and the Duke did not get his Florida holiday. That's kind of something. The Duchess always made an effort, even with her secretary. There came a time when Joanna used to have lunch and dinner with the Duchess unless a guest was expected. The Duchess often used to tease her as the evening drew on, saying she was sure she had a date. Joanna would deny it, never discussing her private life with her employer, but the Duchess had an uncanny instinct about it. Sometimes Joanna didn't escape until very late. "Well, we'll just have a nightcap," the Duchess would say, and Joanna recalled, "I used to have 2 dinners, one with the Duchess and another at midnight." She started working the next day at 10 a.m. Joanna also detected the Duchess's irritation with John Utter, particularly when one night at dinner he placed himself in the chair that the Duke would normally have occupied. The Duchess was furious. Joanna thought Utter was weak and later blamed him for not standing up for the Duchess against her lawyer, Mater Blum. The Duchess still maintained a considerable staff. Georges, officially Gaston Seigneur, had been with the Windsors as butler and major domo since 1948. He was born in Narbonne and began to work for them at the Chateau de la Croix on the Côte d'Azur. He ran the household's domestic affairs. He was a powerful figure. He listened in on corridors and monitored everything that happened. He had the key to the silver safe, and he knew where all the treasures were kept. One of his duties was to count the gold knives, the forks, and the spoons at the end of the dinner parties. Occasionally it fell to him to have to suggest to a departing guest that, inadvertently no doubt, a golden spoon might have jumped into his pocket. Ophelia Bellini, who was born on the Isle of Elba in 1914, came to Paris when she was working for the Countess of Jersey and took the job of working as the lady's maid to the Duchess in 1955. Georges married her in 1959, and they lived at the top of the house. Nothing happened in the house without Georges knowing about it. Friends of the Duchess, such as the Lady Moseley, thought him a saint-like figure in his devotion, but he was a devious man. John Utter, who had to work alongside him for many years, told me that Georges adored the Duchess and did everything in his power to strengthen his position with her. This involved telling tales about others who were working in the house. Georges was destined to stay to the bitter end. He told friends of the Windsors that he had promised the Duke on his deathbed that he would always look after the Duchess. So, too, stayed Ophelia, though the Duchess did not like her and dismissed her 3 times. Georges always managed to get her reinstated. In the early days, Sidney Johnson was still working at the house. Born on Andros in 1923, he was taken on as a beach attendant by the Duke when he was 16 years old. He worked at the government house in the Bahamas and was with the Windsors at Edam Lodge in 1946 when the Duchess's jewels were stolen. He was promoted to be the Duke's valet in the 1960s. Sidney had a French wife, something of which the Duchess had never approved. Sidney, a colored man, marrying a white woman. "My rich Southern blood boils at the thought of mixed marriage," she told Major Gray Phillips. As with John Utter, the first thing the Duchess wanted to do after the Duke died was get rid of Sidney. Oh, poor Sidney, he was a good butler. And when his wife died soon after the Duke and he asked for more time to look after his small children, the Duchess was furious. She dismissed him. John Utter was more disturbed by the way Sidney was treated. After what he called 30 years of slavery to the Duke, he described the dismissal as venomous. There was a chef, Lucien Massey, a sous chef, a gardener and a chauffeur, a night watchman, chambermaids, and other figures. Germaine Bauer, wife of the former chauffeur, was the concierge at the gatehouse and admitted visitors. Gregorio Martin, the Duchess's chauffeur, would become an integral member of the household, traveling with her and cooking for her when they were in America. An intelligent man, he missed nothing and remained loyal to the Duchess to the very end. In his conversation, he recalled those who wished to profit from the Duchess and those who did not. He lived with Maria Costa, who had been a chambermaid and who took over as the Duchess's personal maid in 1974. She, too, was fiercely loyal to the Duchess. Maria was not a trained nurse, but when the Duchess fell ill, it was she who helped the nurses to care for her. She dyed the Duchess's hair, and she was the mainstay of the upstairs rooms. The nurses from the American hospital came and went, but Maria was constant, the one person whom the Duchess knew from happier days. It must have been depressing to stay on in the house for those long years while the Duchess was ill. Once the Duchess lost control over her affairs, the tensions became great. It was like a small court with little for anyone to do and all kinds of machinations going on in the background. The once happy atmosphere deteriorated, and the house descended into a gloom and intrigue. And that's the end of chapter 4. And you'll see the progression of people just vulturing in and taking advantage of the situation. Because the Duke really looked out for her. So we'll see about that. I'm sad to hear that the Duchess was very prejudiced towards Sidney the butler. He was a good butler. You know, that was quite horrible, her behavior to him, especially after losing his wife. But anyway, we will proceed on to the next chapter, and the next chapter is The Lawyer, the Librarian, and the Cousin. And this is from 1972 to 1973. So we'll catch that in another episode. Thank you very much for listening. But these are just pictures of the Duchess. This is at the funeral. This is Wallis. He was handsome. He was a very handsome prince. And this is her in her later years. So